All right, so we are recording. And let me introduce myself. My name is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and it's July 16th, 2014. I'm pleased to be able to host this series of webinars through the Cornell University Cooperative Extension Forest Connect program. We have these monthly webinars, and the technology provides us the benefit, the advantage of being able to bring in some great speakers from wherever they like to sit. And today we are joined by Kevin Dodds, who's a U.S. Forest Service entomologist based in New Hampshire. Kevin and I go way, way back to the early 90s when we were both at Frostburg State University. We worked on a old-growth forest project. Kevin went on to get degrees in forest entomology and then ended up in the Northeast, not too far from New York. So he's been working on the Asian longhorn beetle as well as lots of other bugs, and it was an interesting opportunity to think about the Asian longhorn beetle in rural woodlands. So I'm pleased to introduce Kevin. I'm going to turn the microphone over to him, and I'm just going to mute mine and hover here in the background. So Kevin, welcome and thank you.
Great, thanks, Pete. Thanks for the invitation and the introduction. I'm going to try to keep my eye on the chat window. I don't know how successful I'll be at that, but if there's any sort of pressing questions during the talk, you can type it in there, and I'll try to catch it. If not, if I don't catch it, we'll catch up on a lot of these at the end of the talk today. So what I'm going to go over today are a couple studies that we did looking at ALB behavior in urban-ish forests. And so there's been a fair bit of work done on ALB in the urban setting, but we didn't really know a lot about what ALB would do in a forested environment. And of course, that's really the big question that's on everybody's mind. So the infestation in Worcester provided the opportunity to get into some forested stands, albeit relatively small stands, and start looking around and seeing what ALB was doing in terms of what types of trees were being attacked, what impact we were seeing in tree growth, and then how well ALB was doing in different maple species. So I'll hit two studies today. So our group's been involved in invasive species monitoring for quite a while now. Kind of the assumption when an exotic species is found in North America is that, at least an exotic forest pest, is that it's going to be problematic and that it will be invasive in these areas. And that's not always the case. And so one thing that we've tried to do is really get an idea of what level of impact we're going to see in our regional forest when an insect like ALB arrives. I'm going to cover what we did with ALB today. We've also worked with Cyrex wood wasp, which we've studied in New York and southern Ontario, and that's a pine infesting species that we were worried about. And we were able to collect a lot of data on how well that insect was doing in our pine forests in the Northeast. And then just recently, we finished up some winter moth work. This is work that's actually led by Mike Simmons. He's a graduate student with us, and Tom Lee at University of New Hampshire. And same kind of approach where we looked at the impact of defoliation on individual tree growth, as well as a stand level impact. And winter moth's a much more complicated system because there's several native and exotic pathogens in these forests as well. So you get a lot of interactions occurring. The real goal for anything we do, we are an applied forest entomology group, and so we really want to provide tools that help our state, federal, or tribal partners either prepare or better manage, really prepare and get ready for these insects if they move into their region, and kind of, if we can, develop tools that will help them manage them. Cyrex, we were able to look into some silvicultural options. I think with ALB, some of the results that came out of that relate to how to potentially survey a little bit better for this insect as well. So that's what we really, best case scenario for us is we do these studies, and then at the end of the day, we can provide management options to people. So we're here today about the Asian longhorn beetle. Of course, ALB has been a really successful invader And a lot of that is due to the fact that it's a very polyphagous species, so it can feed on any number of hardwood tree species. So if it gets moved into an area through solid wood packing material or whatever, the chances are when it emerges that it's going to run into something, into a tree that it can successfully oviposit in and have successful reproduction. So that's a huge benefit when you think about invasive species biology. There's been multiple establishments in North America and Europe. There's also been successful eradications of this insect in North America as well. Intercontinentally or between continents, it's primarily moved through solid wood packing material, but when it's in the country, it's primarily moved through. We worry about firewood and wood products, and so that's one of the first things that happens when there's an infestation that's found is that the regulations kick in and you lock down any wood movement. And it is considered an actionable pest, and that means in the U.S. that we are going to try to eradicate any infestation. And there is a history of success with eradicating some of these infestations, and all of the current infestations are under an eradication effort currently. So I just wanted to go through the life cycle really quick. I'm going to hit on this again, but this becomes important when we talk about the second study that I'll cover. But it's a typical cerambycid life cycle. The adult or Asian longhorn beetle is the Lamniinae. It's in the subfamily Lamniinae, and a lot of these feed the same way, where they'll start out in the phloem. If you think about a tree, the phloem is the really nutritious part of the tree. Not a lot of nutrition in sapwood for an insect, and so they get a lot of growth out of feeding in that phloem. And so the life cycle starts off with an adult, with two adults that do their thing, and then you have the females find a susceptible tree, and it's not even really for ALB. It's not a matter of a susceptible tree because they're going to oviposit in living trees. There's no relation that we know of or relationship that we know of between tree stress and oviposition success. So you could get a very healthy looking tree where the female chews these oviposition scars or pits, and I'll have better pictures of these in a few minutes, turns around and deposits an egg in that phloem outer bark interface. So the egg develops into early larva hatches. You have the early stage larva feeding in the phloem area, so again gaining the advantage of that nutritionous material. And then as the insect develops, you get larger instars or larval stages, and these actually start to turn and move into the sapwood. So you get a sapwood entrance hole, and then the larvae are moving through the sapwood, mining that area. They still come out and feed in the phloem, but they're really moving into the wood. Eventually, they create a pupal chamber, and then they pupate and come back out as an adult and start the whole cycle again. I think it was normally or typically considered to be one generation per year in a lot of the infestations. There's some evidence in Worcester that looks like it's taking, at least for a portion of the population, 2 years for one generation. And in some of our tree dissections, we saw evidence that pointed to that as well. And I think some others have seen this too. So that's good news when you think about trying to eradicate something or manage an insect. The longer the generation time, the better. So there's a pretty well-developed host tree list that's out there, and if you want more information than this, you can just Google like APHIS ALB tree list, and you'll see a much larger list. I only included the genera that we're thinking about in the areas that we're working in New England, and in our stand we had maple, birch, and elm. I didn't see any willow, and then the only tree species in a forest setting that we found infested by ALB was maple. So there was birch and elm in our stand, but ALB wasn't on those yet for whatever reason. And then as you move out of New England or even into southern New England, there's some other species that aren't as common up here, tree species that are pretty good hosts. So if you need more information, you may want to check out that list just to see it. But these are the big four that ALB does well on up here. So this is just a map that shows the history of infestations, along with the background of yellow are forests that contain maple. And so you can see that obviously it's what we all know, maple is a very important component of our forests in the region and beyond. There are also maples, of course, in Canada. We just didn't have that, that host flare. But it all started out first in New York here in '96. Shortly after, there was an infestation found in Chicago. Then infestations in New Jersey, Toronto, Worcester in 2008, a very small infestation in Boston in 2010, and a fairly large infestation in Ohio in 2011. And there's also been a recent find earlier this year in New York that I think just ended up with resulted in an expansion of an already active eradication program. It was in Babylon, New York, but I don't have any other details on that. But you can see right away what jumps out at for the Worcester, Massachusetts is, well, it's sitting in an area where there's a lot of maple, but it's adjacent to areas that really have maple as a strong component of the forest type. So the worry, of course, was you can envision any number of ways where material was moved out of Worcester into any number of places where you could get other populations popping back up. And one thing too about Worcester is it has a very well-developed urban forest. So there was a lot of trees. A lot of people had backyards that maybe had 20 or 30 trees. There are obviously street-lined trees as well, but you could see situations pretty easily where maybe somebody would take a tree down in their yard and use it for firewood and head up to New Hampshire or Vermont to go camping. So that was a big concern. Just a little background in Worcester, first detected in 2008, and I think pretty early on, people who had experience with ALB at that time realized that this was probably going to be a larger infestation than what we had seen before. And so there's a pretty rapid response led by APHIS and the State Department of Conservation and Recreation, as well as the Department of Agricultural Resources. The city of Worcester was involved early on, and I assume is still involved, but now we're not just in Worcester. There's some of the adjacent towns are within the quarantine area now as well. And then the Forest Service role was to provide technical assistance where we could. We helped out early on with some of the surveys, and then support of tree climbers and funding to our state partners. Just some numbers to give you an idea of the scale that they're dealing with in Worcester. It's 110 square mile quarantine area. I don't think that has changed since, I don't know, 2011, I think. So it's pretty set right now, which is, I think that's good news that in the last couple of years that hasn't had to be expanded. You can see over close to 5 million trees have been surveyed, so it's a huge effort. And those trees are, ground surveyed with binocular teams, and then many of them are then followed up through climbing. So you have to get climbers up into these canopies to really survey the trees. So we're talking about a huge effort just to survey. Almost 24,000 infested trees have been found, and the vast majority of those have been removed. A total of 33,000 plus trees have been removed. So that would include those infested trees, and then anything deemed kind of a high-risk host tree that was in the area that was likely to be infested or likely to become infested would be removed at the same time. Full host removals have occurred in these forested areas that I mentioned in and around Worcester. So there are some, 10, 12 acre patches and larger forests that fall in this 110 square mile. And so instead of going into a stand multiple times and incurring the cost of multiple entries into a stand, the more logical approach is to go in, if you have a set of infested trees and you have non-infested host trees, you just take them all at one time. That way you don't have to re-enter the stand multiple times if those trees are later found infested. And then you also don't have to worry about surveying them again. Approximately 18,000 trees have been replanted. So it's important to get trees back in these sites. I'll show a picture or two in a second of the changes that have occurred. Worcester is losing some really nice overstory trees, and the replanting effort doesn't just fix that, but at least I think it makes people feel a little bit better that there's a tree back in, and they can take care of that tree and hope that one day it becomes a dominant kind of, urban forestry. So there's been a huge effort there. This is just one of the kind of a typical street in Worcester. You can see a lot of obviously street line trees. I don't know the street, but in a typical scenario, these houses would also have a small patch of forest in the backyard too that were often maple as well. And so after the eradication, you can see how dramatically changed the neighborhoods are. And it's horrible that these people have to lose their trees like that, but at the same time, we have to stop the spread of that beetle. And so you can see it'd be important to get trees back in here as fast as possible. All right, so what I'm going to focus on now has nothing to do with the urban forest per se, and all of our work was, again, just focused at what was going on in the forest. There was other people doing work in the urban setting, and we thought our lab could fit in well with looking at forest impacts. And so there's two studies. The first one is evaluating ALB impact in infested forest stands. So you can think of that as a stand level impact. What types of trees were being attacked? Were there any, were these large trees, small trees? Was ALB impacting tree growth? Questions like that. We also, a study that kind of grew out of that was more of a tree level study where we looked at ALB reproductive success in forest grown maple. So there's not a lot of information like this out there, no information like this out there from a forest, but we wanted to see, is ALB doing better in red maple versus sugar maple versus Norway maple? So we were able to do that in two of the sites. So I'll talk about the stand level work first. I think Pete sent out a link to the papers, and this was the paper that was published in Canadian Journal. It's open access, so it's available. That covered two stands that were red maple dominated. After the paper was out, a year or so later, we found, well, the APHIS-led program found another stand that was sugar maple dominated, and we went out and sampled that using the same method. So that's in here too, but not in the paper. So these are the three stands that we worked in, and you can see Vivendi and Delaval were very, very close to one another. Probably, I don't know, an eighth of a mile, maybe a quarter of a mile separating these, very close to a heavily urbanized area of Worcester, and certainly in kind of Worcester proper. Vivendi was a natural area, Delaval much more what you would think of a small patch urban forest. The Boylston infestation we worked in was outside of the sort of the urban Worcester area, and you can see right away the concern here was it's sitting really at the base of an area with a lot of trees going all the way really heading up north. So, but outside of the sort of Worcester proper infestation. These two were red maple, this was sugar maple. So the Vivendi natural area was a pretty cool area. It's managed by the Worcester Land Trust. It had some trails through the area. We worked in about, it was a little under 100 acres probably where we worked. It was mixed hardwood, but as you moved up, it was certainly kind of more of an oak hickory site with red maple interspersed and moving up from the riparian area down below, and there was one section that was a red maple swamp. We worked in there in 2008. We were actually, unfortunately don't have many good pictures of our work in there because we were doing it always during really stormy conditions. And I think this is one of the last shots. And this was, if you guys remember the large ice storm that hit the region in 2008, we were in there as ice was building up, and that's kind of the last shots that we have of the area, and our camera was freezing up on us. The Delaval stand, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of what you would hope for in an urban forest. Vivendi, a pretty natural, nice place to be. Delaval was more of like a buffer between a highway and a community, highly disturbed. Still some nice larger trees in that area, but you could tell the impact from various activities had occurred in there. Mixed hardwood, the cool thing here for us, and the good thing was that there was Norway red and sugar maple, so that's when we can start comparing reproductive success, or even just at this time, attack intensity, and that may give us some insight into what trees ALB is going for preferentially. We worked in here the winter of 2009 to the early parts of 2010, and so shortly after we did our work in all of these stands, the eradication cuts occurred, and so that was the end of collecting data from these sites. And I found this picture as I was going through things, and this is just in the fall, standing in the Delaval stand, looking across, and this is obviously a heavy industrial area. There's other smaller companies around here, but this is an area that it could be a logical conclusion to draw that maybe the beetle came in here. All around here and just north of here were some really, really heavily infested maple trees. So you can imagine that Delaval had a fair bit of beetle pressure on it for any number of years. And just to go back a little bit, in walking around in Vivendi, it was hard to really see signs or evidence that ALB was there. We saw a few trees, but we're not up in the crowns where the climbers are. We're just looking at from the ground with binoculars, and it was hard to get a sense that ALB was doing a lot in there. But when we got into Delaval, there was definitely more of an oh my kind of feel, where you could see trees that had years of attack on them. The last stand, if you're thinking about Vivendi being a nice place to be and a nice stand with, kind of more a natural forest, and Delaval being kind of on the opposite end of that spectrum, Boylston sort of fell somewhere in between. Nice forest, large overstory trees, a couple road going through it, and then a couple trails, and then a dump area. So at some point it had been a pretty active area for people. About 60 acres and mixed hardwood with, again, Norway red and sugar maple. So this gave us another replicate to use to look at some of the behavior in these trees. And we were in there right at the end of 2010, maybe a little bit in January of 11, but I think we were finished by the end of 10, and then that underwent a eradication cut. So our methods were pretty straightforward. We were 100% dependent on all of the awesome efforts of the tree climbers from APHIS, Forest Service, and DCR. So without their hard work, we couldn't have done any of this. So they climbed all of these trees in the forest stands and then marked them as infested or uninfested. And one thing I want to point out now that'll be relevant in a few slides is we weren't able to separate if a climber marked a tree infested, we treated all of those the same. So that tree could have had one oviposition site or 1,000, and we didn't break those out. We just treated them as infested or uninfested. We followed the climbers through and put in vegetation plots just using standard methods. We used fixed radius plots. We'd look at tree species, diameter, crown class, and then whether or not it was attacked by Asian longhorn beetle. And then we also took tree cores from ALB infested trees as well as uninfested host trees. So we tried to pair those up as best as we could to then do a comparison later on between the growth of those two tree classes. So I'm going to go through a series. I'm going to go stand by stand, and all of the graphs will be the same for each stand. And this first one is just the importance value. If you're not familiar with importance value, it's the average of the relative basal area and relative stem density. And so you can see for Vivendi, red maple was the most important species, but we had a lot of oak in there, and then of course some hickory as well. And this importance value for red maple is highly weighted by the number of stems, more so than basal area. These graphs will all be the same too as we go through, but just to get you oriented, this is a size class distribution in centimeters. It's the smallest tree we surveyed was 7.5 centimeters, and then we go up to 90+ centimeters. And then it's the number of trees that are in each class on the Y. The green bar represents trees, and I say trees, but these are all maples, so sorry about that. These are all maples. So the green bar represents maples that did not have ALB, and that black bar are ALB infested trees. So this is one of the things that I usually look at first when we're starting to work on a new insect, is try to get an idea if there any pattern to the attack. If you're thinking about if you could use silviculture to modify your stands or anything like that, you'd like to see maybe the attacks concentrated up here or maybe in some of the smaller stuff. And then you can go and manipulate that stand, but unfortunately we don't see any pattern like that. You can see all of the available size classes are actually have infested trees in there. This is canopy class on the X, and then the number of trees in each canopy class. Same setup. Black represents ALB infested trees. Green represents uninfested maple. It is, and you can see we had a situation where the largest trees, the codominant and dominant trees, were more frequently attacked and had ALB in them more frequently than did the overtop trees. In this stand, the intermediate trees sort of fell in between there. So it looks like something's going on with the larger trees more frequently having ALB associated with them. So looking at just the numbers, in Vivendi, we had 26% of that basal area was red maple, 32% of that was infested by Asian longhorn beetle. So a fair bit of activity. We never saw the crowns. We weren't there when the trees came down. But you know, a fair bit of ALB activity in those trees, or I'm sorry, in that stand. Looking at the radial growth, the dashed line is infested and the solid black line is uninfested. And you know, following through the chronology, you don't see a lot, some separation here and there. We chose to look, we looked at a number of things, but I'm just showing the last 10 years because that was a conservative estimate of how long ALB had been in the stand. Don't see a lot of separation on the chronology. When we looked at it statistically, the last 10 years of growth, so that's before we cut the tree, of course, or cord the tree, no significant difference. The standardized ring width index, same thing. There's no significant difference between the attacked and unattacked trees. And again, for this stand where we didn't have a feel for it being heavily infested, it kind of makes sense you wouldn't see separation, because remember, all of these trees that are in this, that make up this bar, we didn't know if they were one oviposition pit or 1,000. We didn't know if they had exit holes or anything. We just grouped them all together. So if there wasn't a lot of activity in those trees, we wouldn't expect to see differences, even if they were colonized by Asian longhorn beetle. And this is just a stem map. I know it's not awesome, but I wanted to put it in there just to talk about it anyways. The red triangles represent infested trees. The green represent uninfested host trees. And one of the things that we were dealing with when we first went in was that a lot of people considered ALB to be an edge specialist, and there was some talk that maybe it wouldn't even penetrate sort of solid stands into the interior of stands. And we quickly saw that that wasn't the case. We mapped everything, and you can just see that there are a lot of pockets of infested trees well throughout the stand. There's some up here as well. I do think that there's something going on with ALB and edges, and that they maybe get established there and do quite well in those trees, but they're certainly capable and readily move through forested stands, which is not really the kind of news that you want to see, but it's important when you start thinking about surveying. So this is the size class distribution before eradication, just to give you an idea of some of the impacts that we're seeing. I think in Vivendi we had 14 tree species, so that would be anything over 7.5 centimeters with our sampling protocol. After eradication, this is what is now on the site, and you can see it's a solidly oak hickory forest. I think a lot of people would be happy with that change, because that's really what should have been on the site in the first place, but maple had encroached significantly. So oak hickory forest on an oak hickory site now. There are some significant changes have occurred though, and this is one of the last pictures we have. The orange, don't worry about the flagging. The orange is I think non-host trees, and the blue were infested trees, and this was for our mapping effort. But just to give you an idea of the stand conditions before and then the stand conditions after. So dramatically different, and certainly ecologically speaking, there's going to be a lot of changes that are occurring in that understory. It'll be interesting to see what happens with that. This picture is from, I don't know, probably 3 years ago, I think, and I haven't been back there, so I'm sure it's I'm positive it's a completely different look to the stand now. But I mean, the good news to me, anyways, is this is still a forest, and there can still be trails through there, and it's still probably not a bad place to be as long as the trails get cut back from the understory response. And looking at it aerially, you can see obviously, closed canopy forest that covered the area, and still parts of it still very much the same, but we do have a lot more canopy disturbance. Here's a pretty large canopy gap there, same down here, and then a lot of smaller ones. But again, still a forest there, which is good news. The basal area here was reduced by 35%, and the number of stems were reduced by 50%. And this goes back to just how many stems were there of red maple. So moving into Delaval, so remember Delaval was that smaller stand that was had a lot more urban impacts to it. You can see this was also red maple dominated. We had Norway and sugar as important species as well, and red oak and white ash were in there too. Same slide setup as before. Same pattern too, a little bit more ALB activity, but we've got attacks in all of the size classes of the tree. So again, nothing necessarily helpful when you think about trying to, if we ever get to a point where we have to manage this insect in a naturalized environment, nothing that's really jumping out that would be helpful in terms of diameter classes anyways. In crown classes, this time we saw that the intermediate trees grouped with the codominant and dominant trees, and I think this was a stand that there was a lot more activity in. So it could be a situation where they're going into the larger trees and then maybe moving down a little bit. So that's why the intermediate trees grouped this time with codominant and dominant trees. So all of these were more frequently attacked than the overtop trees. So you can see much more activity in this stand. 63% of the maple was infested by Asian longhorn beetle. I think in Vivendi we had 32%. And there's also 63% of the basal area was maple species here. So again, this was a stand that felt like, okay, ALB is doing a lot of damage in there. Now, whether ALB would, eventually they would outright, girdle and kill the tree, but I think before that happens in the forest anyways, you're going to get a fair bit of structural failure that'll lead to tree mortality. Chronology here, all over the place, and I think that represents just the level of disturbance in the stand. There was, an old forest road, and we cored some trees along that. There was some gaps. There's a red maple swamp. So I think our sampling was, the trees were much more varied that we took cores from compared to Vivendi. We did find a significant difference in, statistically speaking, in the growth over the last 10 years, and the same for the standardized ring width index between the ALB attacked trees and unattacked trees. And this may be a more logical situation, because I think in here, while our trees were in a pretty growing in a pretty diverse forest in the sense of, openings and disturbance and all of that, the trees that we selected as ALB infested trees tended to, what I think is going on is they were closer together in terms of the density and intensity of attack by ALB. So we didn't have as much noise in our infested tree chronology at the end. The important thing, or another important thing to keep in mind as I go through all of this, is this information comes from only 3 stands, and so we hope and we know that what we did is solid. We're comfortable with the data that we collected and everything, but it is still only 3 stands, and each study we only worked in 2 of the stands. So it'll be interesting. Hopefully we don't get the opportunity to do these studies in any other forest. But if we do, it'd be important to gather this type of information to see if these types of patterns hold. This was an interesting figure that a set of data that came out of Delaval that we couldn't get out of Vivendi, because in Vivendi we only had red maple, But here we were able to look at the attack frequency, and so the number of oviposition pits would let you draw some conclusions based on attractiveness of a tree. It doesn't say anything about how well ALB does in these trees. It just means that they were drawn to them for whatever reason. And you can see that, I mean, the first thing that pops out is, yeah, there's a lot of red maple, a fair bit of Norway maple as well. But even without the statistics, it looks like, oh, something's going on with red maple being attacked more frequently than the others. So we ran some statistics that accounted for the frequency of the tree in the forest, and we did, and the pattern still held that red maple was more frequently attacked than sugar maple or Norway maple. So that was interesting, and that kind of led us into, I'm not going to get there just yet, but it leads us into our second study where we wanted to look at, well, was ALB also developing better in red maple over sugar or Norway? And this is just an aerial shot. Well, this is our stem map, just to give you another view of what's going on in the forest. Now, this isn't all that impressive when you talk about penetrating the interior of a forest. Certainly all of this area of the stand was impacted by edge effects anyways, and then we've got a large gap here, so these edge effects went further in as well. But ALB readily moved through this stand. This was a red maple swamp that was heavily infested as well. So no problem there for ALB moving right through an urban forest. Just an aerial view before, you can see closed canopy forest. This is the neighborhood that's of course buffered by, this is 190, which is a pretty active road. I mean, this is an exit road, but this is 190. And after the eradication cut that was necessary, you see a completely different situation than Vivendi, where hard pressed to call this a forest. Certainly changed probably the lives of the people on this hill in terms of the sound buffer and everything. But these were heavily infested trees that had to go. They would have been a source for a lot of beetles. So basal area here was reduced by 73% and the number of stems by 84%. And so dramatic changes to this forest stand. So moving into Boylston, again, this was that sugar maple stand a little bit outside of the Worcester area, dominated by sugar maple in terms of importance value. There was a lot of white ash in there, black and red oak, and then red maple was an important species as well. There was Norway maple present in the stands too. So back to these figures, you can see, again, same pattern. You know, we've got activity in any size class available. In terms of canopy class, codominant and dominant trees were found more frequently attacked by ALB than overtop trees. And this time, like Vivendi, the intermediate canopy class fell in between those two categories, or between overtop and codominant and dominant. Less activity here too, with 13% of the maple infested by Asian longhorn beetle. So it was an interesting stand where we weren't seeing a lot of activity in terms of attacks of the trees, but there were some very heavily attacked trees on the edge and also in the interior of the forest as well. Like, so ALB had been there a number of years. And then 27% of the basal area was in maple species. So this is a figure like I showed before, and different pattern here. We found no significant difference in the frequency of attack between red, sugar, and Norway. But what's interesting is, you know, that sugar maple was the most abundant tree species, and so you would almost think just by chance that that would be more frequently attacked, but we didn't see that. And so red maple, in a stand that it was much less common, was still equally attacked as sugar maple, and same story for Norway maple as well. So I'll move into the second part of the study. So you can see, just so from the previous study, we ended with this, you know, wondering, well, okay, we feel pretty good about that. There's something going on with red maple, but we didn't know what was going on in the tree. So we could say, okay, it looks like red maple may be a more attractive host, but is it also a better host? And is it more suitable for ALB development? So we really needed to get into the trees to try to figure that out. And this is work that our group did in Durham, and we worked with Helen Hull-Sanders at the Otis lab, and she took over. If some of you may be familiar with Al Sawyer, he was doing a lot of this aging of damage, and Helen took over some of that work when Al retired. So she worked with us to really kind of solidify this study. So we did this study in 2 stands. We did it in Belleville and in Boylston. And one thing I want to say right away is, so Asian longhorn beetle reattacks the same tree. So you have damage that's occurred over multiple years. And so you can't use kind of traditional methods like life table analysis or survivorship, because we couldn't follow brood through and assign a generation stat. So we just pulled it all together and looked at what went in and what came out of these trees. And so there won't be any type of survivorship data or anything like that, because we just were not able to do that. And I'm going to only show the information from Boylston. The Delaval information is in the paper in Insects that was published earlier this year. So again, we used pretty standard methods. We went in, found infested Norway, red, and sugar. We dropped those, cut those trees into 1 meter lengths, noting the position in the tree or on the tree, so we could look at height. We cut up the canopy, so we dissected the canopy as well. And then we would start going through these pieces to look for evidence of life stages. And if you go back to that life cycle, we were using a combination of actual living ALB or ALB life stages, and then evidence that they had matured to a certain point in development. And so what I mean by that is we could actually dissect and find eggs, and we could find early stage larvae pretty frequently feeding in the phloem. So we would pull these oviposition pits, and I'll show pictures of these next. And so we had estimates of these based off of their presence. When it got to mid and late stage larvae, we really had to look at, we were looking for that sapwood entrance hole, and that would be an indication that ALB had developed to that stage and then went into the wood. And then for adults, we used just the presence of the exit holes. In one situation, we actually found a late stage larva, but that was it. We only ever found one. And so all of the other evidence was based off of that sapwood entrance hole. So just to go through some of the evidence that we were using, so we were looking for these oviposition sites, and that was one of the things that we counted was oviposition sites, because that gives us insight into attractiveness of the tree. And then we pop these and look for the eggs, because not every oviposition site has an egg. But you can see here is this characteristic of a pit. You'll see there's mandible marks around it, and you can also see the slit that the female makes into the phloem, where she then turns around and deposits an egg. So this would be probably a pit that occurred that same year as the picture. It's adjacent to an older pit, and you can see this is starting to crack because the tree is responding to that wound behind it with callus tissue. So right here, you can tell, okay, we've got, ALB's been on this tree for a couple of years. Amazingly, at least to us when we were out there, this is also an oviposition pit. And when we first walked up to this tree, we thought something was odd about it, and we dissected this and found that a gallery went off of the back of it. And I'll show another shot of this, but there are actual mandible marks here and curvature of the pit right there. But so when you start seeing damage like this, you start really wondering how long the insect had been in the stands. Again, these are just pits that are on a thinner bark tree, so there's a lot of variability, and you really have to do some detective work when you're looking for these things. And here's one of the older callus oviposition pits. There are the mandible marks, and the sun angle really kind of messed up my photo, but all right here where that pointer is, you could see mandible marks and really just that curvature of the pit. And so when we would pop these off, we used an arc punch or a hatchet, you'd see larval feeding, and then sometimes it going all the way into sapwood entrance hole. So it was obvious that they were associated with Asian longhorn beetle. You can see here where we've taken an arc punch and hammered it in and pulled the bark away from the oviposition pit, flipped it over. Sometimes the eggs would stick into the underside of the bark sample that we'd take off. But this is an egg sitting against the tree. There's some staining associated with it. Here's the larva right there, and there's the egg was probably laid down here, and this is all larval feeding right there. So these are the life stages that we were actually able to see and count. Moving through the tree, so this is when we would really start dissecting the tree. If we found any indication of a gallery, we would just cut our 1 meter sections into cookies and try to follow it all the way through. This is the one late larva that we found, and you can see it's a big juicy larva. We actually cut its head off with the chainsaw, and so big juicy larva in these trees. And so you can see the gallery there. That would be associated with the sapwood entrance hole and the face out here. And we would just cut that into pieces and follow it to where we could find if it ended in an exit hole like this gallery. Here's another shot of that. Here's a gallery. This is staining, maybe some fungal staining, but certainly part of the response from the wind response from the tree. This is actually right there on the top part of my pointer. That's the exit hole. This is all callus tissue that forms over that. So again, looking at fairly old damage in this stand. Exit holes were interesting too. This is the kind of the standard round exit hole. Pete had some pictures up of an unknown specimen or an unknown insect from a sugar maple sample earlier, and this is a nice, perfectly round hole. That picture that he has up there still is a much more oval exit hole, indicating it's a different type of insect. But this was an ALB exit hole. Seems pretty straightforward at that point, like, okay, we can do this pretty easily. But then you start seeing things like this. This one's pretty straightforward. There's it's a callus exit hole. We would cut that section, follow the gallery back, just to make sure it was associated with ALB. Here's some of the old damage, and this is in the Boylston stand. If you remember that there was pretty low ALB activity at the stand level, but some of the trees were hammered by ALB. And this is all callus tissue that formed around the phloem area that the larvae fed in. This is one of those sapwood entrance holes where the developing larva would go in and start mining in the sapwood and then come out here as an exit hole. This may have been another sapwood entrance hole like this for another gallery, or it could have been a woodpecker hole going in after the larva. It could be both too. You often see a sapwood entrance hole expanded by a woodpecker going in trying to get the juicy larva out. Another exit hole that is completely callus. You can see feeding up here with the callus tissue as well. Same thing here. That's a calloused exit hole. We've got a lot of damage here and here that had both of these sections of this tree had sapwood entrance holes and exit holes. This is another exit hole, and here's an exit hole too. So a wide range of difference. And when you talk about what you would go out kind of expecting to see when you're surveying for a Cerambycid beetle. But again, these are living trees, and they're not. The insect's not putting in a fungus or anything with it that's detrimental to the tree. So it really just has to deal with that sort of structural disturbance. So jumping into the data, so here's the ALB oviposition sites, and this is the average number of oviposition sites per tree. So again, remember, this could give us some information on the attractiveness of the 3 tree species for ALB. And right away, again, red maple jumps out. Statistically, more oviposition pits were found on red maple over sugar maple or Norway maple. In terms of exit holes, which would lean a little bit more towards tree susceptibility or suitability for ALB, same pattern, much more variability, but still statistically more ALB coming out of red maple compared to sugar and Norway maple. this is a cumulative reproductive success. So it's a ratio of the number of eggs that went into the trees to the number of adults that came out, or exit holes. And I didn't statistically analyze this. It was zero inflated, so there's a lot of zeros in the data set. I'll show you that in a second. But it's one of those things that even without the stats, I think it's important to show that it looks like there's definitely something going on here with a higher reproductive success in red maple, so red maple's producing more beetles for what goes in, what comes out, that ratio compared to sugar or Norway. It's important to note that by no means am I saying that sugar maple or Norway maple are not good hosts. In fact, we didn't really see it with Norway, but with sugar maple, we did have some trees that produced a relatively high number of brood. I'll show that in a second. But it does, again, point towards something going on with red maple, and it'll be interesting that if there's more stands to see if this pattern holds. And this is an exit hole kind of classification. It's the number of exit holes that a tree had on the X and the number of trees in that exit hole classification. So that, or class, that goes from 0 to greater than 10. So this, you can see right away the majority of trees are in the 0 exit hole class, meaning that no matter what tried to go into them, and that can be attack or later stage larva, whatever, nothing came out of them. And so that's certainly the majority of sugar and Norway maple. Fewer red maple produced 0 brood. And you can see our red maple produced we had more trees that produced more brood in red maple. This tree here, I think actually, I meant to look up the number before, but I forgot, but I think it's around 30 or 33 exit holes or adults came out of that tree. And this is what I was getting to with that sugar maple, that it's still a good host. This bar right here is a sugar maple that had 8 exit holes. So 8 adults came out of that one tree. So again, it's not that, it still appears to be a very good host, just maybe not as productive as red maple. And it would be interesting, and we don't have physiology data or anything like that, but it would be interesting to know what went on with that sugar maple compared to some of the reds. But interesting nonetheless, and this was really the key interesting point for us was, well, maybe something's going on in terms of host tree defenses, or later on in the development, if ALB became established in these trees, and so you had successful oviposition, development through the larval stages, either insect predators or parasitoids were getting them, or woodpeckers. So something seemed to be going on that was limiting successful reproduction. Now, it could be also that this is early in infestation. As the trees wear down, you get more successful reproduction. I've been really bad at looking. I've tried to follow this chat list, but sometimes it moves pretty fast. But I see Greg has a question about how does reproductive success in red maple compare to reproductive success in tree species in China? And that's a great question. And unfortunately, I can't answer that. I haven't seen much information about reproductive success in various trees in China. There was a partial life table done, but I'm not sure that they even broke it out by tree species. So sorry, I don't have anything on that. If somebody else on the call does, I know there's certainly some forest entomologists and people that have dealt with ALB, and probably even some that have been to China. They can chime in on that dialogue if that would be helpful. So one of the key pieces of information that you have to think about when you're doing work like this is the age of attack. So you're assuming when you go out and do this type of work that all of those trees kind of came under attack at the same time. So the red maple were attacked the same year as the sugar and the Norway, or at least very closely associated, in timing. What you could have is that, since we're retrospectively looking back over maybe a 5 or 10 year period of attack, you could have a situation where the red maple were all attacked 6 years ago, and when we're attacked for 2 or 3 years sugar maple wasn't touched. And then the insect moved to sugar maple or Norway maple and started attacking that. So when you go out to do these comparisons of oviposition pits and exit holes, it's not a fair or legitimate comparison. Thankfully, Helen had all of this age information for the stand because we couldn't do that ourselves because the other lab was doing it. Al Sawyer was doing it at the time. And so you can see from here, this is on the X is the year of earliest Asian longhorn beetle attack on a tree. And so not all of our experimental trees overlap, but the vast majority of them did. And so you can see the earliest sign of an attack in that stand. And this is based off of the way the figure is it's based off of, even if the early sign of attack that she could find was an exit hole, we would back it off 1 year. So we're not assuming a 2-year life cycle here, we're assuming a 1 year. So it could have been an exit hole found in 2007 on a sugar maple, but we backed it to 2006 because that's when the attack would have occurred. And so you can see that sugar maple was the first tree that we found attacked in the stand. In 2007, you start seeing red maple and sugar maple attack. 2008, just red maple, nothing in 2009, and then in 2010, a lot goes on. We see, attacks stepping up on Norway and on sugar, and some reds as well. I feel pretty good about this data. I do know from our tree dissections that we found a Norway that had an exit hole. So we know that on Norway it had been at least 2009 as well, and this was the one drawback of not using the exact same trees for dissection as we did for aging tree damage. But anyways, I think we were pretty fortunate that in terms of all of the comparisons I just showed you, I feel they're legitimate because the timing of attack was generally the same. We've got red and sugar coming under attack about the same time, followed a little bit later by Norway. But the important tree species for us are, of course, red and sugar are what we really want to get information on. Just looking over Andy Smith, how vulnerable are the red oaks? The red oaks were once listed as susceptible. I think there had been documented oviposition sites on there, and there was a lab study with it. They're not considered a susceptible host. They're not cut out during the eradication effort or anything like that. So Stacy has a very good question. Do these results indicate the host tree choice may be based at least partially on location? That is, ALB infests a few sugar maples, then simply moves to the closest tree nearby those sugar maples, regardless of species. I don't know for sure. I think what happened in Boylston, anyways, is that there may have been a bit of an edge effect. So the edge trees were hit. They were red, but there was also some sugar right behind it, and then they moved, probably moved into adjacent red and sugar and dispersed. After that, in a typical scenario with an insect, you're looking at least some percentage of that population coming out of a host tree that's going to fly off and infest a new tree or look for a new host. So I don't think that the only thing going on here is that it's just that it's adjacent trees. So if you just happen to have sugar maple in one area, they're going to get attacked first. I hope that answers your question. This is just, I told you we broke out the bulb by, when we did our tree dissections, we broke it out by height. And this is just the oviposition activity by height. And, a huge amount of efforts is put forth to survey the tree crowns because there's already knowledge out there that there's a preference to see oviposition in the crown. And we just were trying to see if it was the same in the forest, and unfortunately it is, where all of the activity the activity is more common in the crown versus the top or bottom of the bowl, and that was just under the base of the live crown. And I say that's unfortunate because that just makes survey much more difficult and more expensive. So what have we learned? I went through a lot of stuff, and I'll be happy to take more questions afterwards. But the first thing that jumped out was, that ALB is not outright killing trees. So it's not moving through a stand as fast as, say, Asian longhorn beetle or some of these exotic bark beetles that also carry a fungi or fungus with them. So, if you have it in a stand, if it was to ever become naturalized, then I have no reason to believe that the eradication effort isn't going to work or anything like that. I'm just saying if we ever get to a point where, multiple infestations are found that are very large, or the money is not there to try to eradicate these infestations, this is what, we may have some management tools in terms of, it's slow moving in the stands. It does somewhat stay on the same tree for a few years. So, you could go through, you could have a situation where you had an infested forest with ALB present, and you had some sort of focal trees that had a lot of activity, and you could drop those, and I think you would, substantially slow the spread in your stand. And then maybe have to do that every couple of years as the population moves through. ALB was only in maple and forest stands. There was elm and birch. I think in both of those genera were in 2 of our stands, and I think all 3. And we never found any evidence of ALB on them. And I think probably what would have occurred is at some point they would have made the jump to those trees as well. But for whatever reason, early on they're staying with maple, at least in these stands. ALB was found in forest trees of all sizes, although we saw more activity on these larger, more dominant, codominant trees in the stand. ALB attacked and survived at higher rates in red maple, so it looks like not only is red maple more attractive to ALB in these stands, but it's also a better host tree for development early on at least. And then the applied results are really important for us. Again, we're an applied group, so these are some things that I hope are helpful to people who are out surveying for the insect. There's been a lot of effort to survey campgrounds, and various states put in different levels of impact of effort to try to look at high-risk sites and see if ALB has been moved into the area. The first thing is that red maple is preferentially attacked in forests, so I think you could skew your survey efforts a little bit towards red maple. You don't want to just completely omit surveying, Norway or sugar, but there is something going on with red maple. The APHIS program in Worcester did like a pilot study where they used the density of red maple in areas outside of the primarily infested or eradication area. And they used this to be able to prioritize forests so they could go out and survey and see if ALB was in these stands. And so it was an interesting way to approach things, kind of like a landscape scale risk rating. And so we were pretty excited that our data could be used to sort of guide something like that. And APHIS did a great job designing that and running that survey. And I believe it's still ongoing. There's many trees with a few ALB signs. So I kind of expected when I started working on this in the forest that I'd walk in and see something almost right away. But we really you have to walk around and look for look really closely at a lot of trees, because you may be standing at a tree that has one overposition site, and if you're not at the right angle or your binoculars can't see up far enough, you'll just miss it. You also have to move throughout the stand. I mean, I do think there's something to the edges. You have to start at an edge anyways to get into a forest, so spend some time there, but then also move throughout the forest stand or the campground or wherever it is that you're surveying and really look around at the trees. Attacks seem to be more frequent in the crowns. That's, again, not new knowledge, just backing up what has been seen for years and why the survey effort is so expensive, and there's so much effort to get up into the trees. And then the damage to the trees occurs over years, so you have to be prepared to do some detective work. We were sort of fortunate that we could cut the trees down and dissect them, but in a campground or in a private forest where people may not want trees dropped just to check out something, it's a little bit different of a situation. But you really will have to think about what that damage could be, what it looks like, get pictures of it, send it around to some other people to get their view of it. And then large trees are more frequently attacked, and that large trees, meaning really crown class, the codominant and dominant, and that could just, we don't know what's going on with that. It could just be that they're, a large tree is larger. It has a larger surface area for ALB to kind of run into almost, but there's something going on there. I see a question from about Ohio. So is the Ohio infestation showing similar preference for red maple? I don't know. We've talked a little bit with some of the people out there about when they have infested forest stands that we would go out and try to sample them. I think we got in contact with them a little bit late where there's pretty aggressive tree felling to get that infestation under control. And I do think that they're seeing a lot of attacks on red maple, but I don't know if red maple is being attacked more frequently than some of the other host species they have out there, because they're dealing with a different forest type than what we have. So they have some other important trees that ALB would be attracted to. So I think I have this in just as a last sort of ditch effort of reiterating that we're not out of the woods with sugar maple, but it is kind of nice to see that maybe sugar maple is not an awesome host. It's going to be a good host probably, but the sugar maple distribution obviously much more northern. But the bad news is, at least to me, is that when you start thinking about red maple, being a fairly good or a good host for Asian longhorn beetle, and you think about that tree, I mean, ecologically speaking, it has a wide niche breadth. So you can find it anywhere from growing well and from a swamp to an upland forest. So it's successful in a large area ecologically, and then geographically, it's just widespread. So when you think of the possibility of populations, new populations coming in, perhaps it's always a tree that it's not always, but it's a tree that they're likely to run into at some point and get established in. And then certainly up here, it's a widespread tree that could provide a lot of host material for it. So a lot of people helped with these studies. They were it was really a lot of effort went into them. Our group in Durham included technicians as well as some of our STEP students, our GIS folks. We had help on some of the stats from John Stanovich at the Northern Research Station. Clint McFarland and Ken Gooch helped us get into access the stands to do our work. Michael Smith is a research biologist, research scientist with ARS. He's a ALB expert, and he was out with us early on, and that was a huge help having him out there with us. The APHIS and Forest Service tree climbers, I should also add the DCR had tree climbers as well at different points, so they were critical to the work. And then the landowners that allowed us access to their stands. There's the links to the publications. You may already heard enough and be bored to death of ALB, so just ignore them. They're open access and available if you would like to read them. So I think with that, I'll take any questions. I don't know, I'll go through here and see if I missed anything.
Kevin, great job. I can also scan backwards and look for questions. And just to point out, a few people have posted some links on the site. So, which is one of the neat things about this kind of interaction, is that people that have found information can share that with everybody who's there. So certainly folks can start typing in questions. I've posted the exit survey, and I'll also send that out directly to all the participants, but it's important for us to get your feedback on these. As people are writing in questions, I had a couple that came to mind, Kevin, so
Sure.
One of the beauties of being host here is that I can preemptively strike with questions. So, I mean, you had you were working in there. I mean, these are rural forests, but they're in proximity to a lot of landowners, and one of your pictures showed I'm guessing the property lines, and so you had a lot of, I mean, the team of people, and you've indicated there's a broad group of people. What was the nature of the communications that happened with the various landowners? I mean, certainly there was a lot of interest and concern by the people whose backyards were being impacted by this.
Yeah, I mean, sure. So we weren't actually involved in much of that, but that, so this was all part of the eradication effort in Worcester. So, either APHIS or mostly DCR folks would visit the house, leave information if nobody was home saying that, your property had been surveyed. And then I think anytime a tree was going to get cut down or so if there was going to be an eradication effort on that property, there would be much more communication back and forth between the landowner and either the feds or the state folks. And so in a situation like with that forested area, Delaval is a good example. That was a neighborhood up at the top of the hill. So everybody up there would have known what was going on below. And then, for us doing the forest side of stuff, we would work through Clint with APHIS or Ken Gooch with DCR to make sure it was okay that we went in. And in some of those cases, we also talked to, like for the Vivendi site, I also talked to the land trust leadership just to make sure it was okay we went in.
There were, you noted some differences in the early slides when you were showing the different sites. Not huge differences, but do you think those were associated with the time since the stands were infested, or with differences in species composition, or some differences in the history of those stands? Any sense about how that plays into the dynamics of Asian longhorn emu stands?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't really have a good answer. I mean, Delaval and Vivendi were very, very close to one another. Delaval was directly across from a heavily infested area. It was much more edge. But Vivendi, probably an eighth of a mile up the road from it. So you'd think that they both would be under equal pressure from the population source. Structurally, the forest, we had, overtopped intermediate codon trees in each of those stands. We had very similar species mixes. I don't really know. I would have expected at least Vivendi and Delaval. So if people are looking on the map now, I would have expected these two to have very similar attack intensities or the same kind of feel, but it was very much different. This felt like, oh wow, this is an insect that's doing a lot of damage. This didn't feel that way as much, but again, we didn't dissect trees here, and that may have biased us a little bit. So you would think, okay, these would be more heavily attacked than here, right? Because this is well outside of the known infested area at the time. This was probably an infestation that started through movement of wood or something like that. On a stand level, right, there wasn't a lot of ALB activity, but on certain trees there was damage that went back 5 or 6 years. So the insect had been doing well in there as well. It just hadn't spread out all the way well. I mean, it had moved through the stand, but we weren't seeing the same level of attacked trees. So I wish I had a more clear-cut answer for you, but nothing jumped out in terms of, I mean, proximity a little bit, just because Delaval was directly across, but Vivendi was hardly, just a little bit more uphill from that.
Right. So there's my final question, and I also see Tammy Craig, who I think is maybe with a survey group out of the Worcester area. You mentioned that there's elm and birch that are on the host list. Are there efforts to re-inspect those trees to make sure that none of those have been reinfested, and that the insects were contained within maples?
Right. Yeah. So I didn't go into the eradication effort that much, but all of those would have been removed as well. So in the forest, it's a 100% host removal. So anything birch around would have gone.
Okay, all right, got it. You did mention that in terms of the reinspection, the efforts for reinspection. So, all right, well, I'm going to let you look over at some of the questions. I see one from Rick Peruco wants to know if you think that the red maple was maybe inviting attack by being less vigorous in most stands. So are there differences in tree vigor in those between reds and sugars?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, a lot of insects, especially wood borers, you'd expect that you'd see some type of response like that, you know, stressed trees are better habitat. That doesn't seem to be the case for ALB. We didn't directly look at that, but we did have, you know, we had tree growth from a subset of attacked and unattacked maple, and those were all red maples in Vivendi. And we didn't get any indication that the attacked trees were slower growing or under more stress that we could relate to anyway, or that we could document. So, and I think this has been looked at a little bit by some other people, and it's not an insect that really cues on stress volatiles like some of our native species. It's just going after living trees for whatever reason.
Okay.
I see Carl had a question. How are municipalities coping with the loss of street trees from the Asian longhorn beetle infestation, that is replacement trees, etc.? I hit on that just a little bit. I've never really been involved in that program, but it's a huge program led by DCR now, but certainly the Forest Service and APHIS have provided funding that goes to the state that then helps, and I may not have all of those details right, but I know that some of the funding has gone to the state where they then work with people who have had their trees removed to get new trees in the ground. And of course, these are not host trees that are being replanted, and they're not, I would assume they're not ash trees either. There's a little thread of emerald ash below. So it's a very big effort. You know, Mike Bona's on here. There's some other people on here that maybe have more to add to that. If they do, I'm not putting anybody on the spot. You can type it in. But I'll just say that it's an important component of the eradication effort.
Yeah, there are several people from state agencies and federal agencies, so feel free to chime in as questions come up and you have things to add. Let's see.
I see impact on local budgets from ALB and other infestations. Well, it can be dramatic. You know, you're talking about the tree removal process. If there's no additional funding, you could. So if no funding went into Worcester and the city was left to deal with this alone, they'd be constantly removing trees, and you can imagine how quickly the budgets would go. So yeah, it can be pretty intense for local governments to have to deal with this, even when federal funding is coming in, because federal funding has to be matched as well. But yeah, it's not an easy situation. For ALB, EAB is a little bit faster moving, of course, and that's also hitting urban forests.
Are the eradications in these areas, are those traditional logging crews that come in, or are they more like arborist crews that come in? Do you have a sense? And then what do they chip it on site? I'm assuming they don't move logs and materials around.
Correct. Yeah, it's all chipped and it's chipped in that area. There at one point the chips were being moved, and then there was some states didn't want the chips, and so I don't know where that stands now. But it's a mix. You know, some of the bigger urban tree companies have contracts and are in there. I think some local foresters have been able to bid on the host tree removals that occur in the forested stands. But again, I mean, I don't want to keep saying this, but I mean, it's a little bit outside of my interaction with the program, and that falls more to APHIS and the states. But that's my sense is that you have a real mix, and certainly some of the larger urban forestry companies that have been in there. I mean, I've seen their trucks in and around, and then it's more of a local, probably forester group going in and doing the host tree removals from forests.
All right. So another, and this is maybe just a casual observation. I'm not sure there's any comments you would or could make. But when you're showing the closure of the exit holes, it struck me that's when I do a fair amount of work with maple syrup production, looking at tap hole closures, and those holes appear to close from the sides. And so as that hole is closing, you're left with a vertical, well, okay, actually the one on the right there looks more like it, but some of the other ones looked like it was, maybe look at some other closed exit holes. Maybe I'll just stop talking. Okay, so some of those look, the one on the left, for example, looks like it's not closing laterally, but closing from all sides concurrently. I mean, I'm not sure what, maybe it's just an observation, maybe it's not an accurate observation, but it struck me as a curious, the pattern of closure appears to be different on that callus tissue on the ALB exit holes than on tap holes, sugar maple tap holes.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the first couple we came across, that was a question. Like, wait a minute, is this because it was lower on the tree? And like, is this a tap, a callus tap hole? But, so like for this one, we would cut through it on each cut here, and there was always galleries there. So,
yeah.
But we had the benefit of being able to cut the tree. But for anybody out and surveying, it's a good point. Like, that's something that you have to kind of piece through the history of that stand you're in, and knowledge of whether it was tapped or not. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's just, to me, it's kind of funny when I look at the different, it's so odd the way some of them have closed. I mean, these two are completely different than this one. And I have no clue what would make, a tree close that way compared to this way.
Sure.
It may be just a disruption above, I mean, there's a lot of disruption to phloem and everything up here. Maybe that ties into how it can close.
True. So Mike has posted some information about funding, which is helpful.
Great.
And Karen's asking if you had an estimate of how long each of those forested stands have been infested.
Yeah, I mean, we don't, not for each of them. I mean, we're the only stand we have the definitive age data is here. I think that Helen is working with some other people to look at the more, they have age data from a larger area. I don't think they have it from the forest that we worked in. I mean, my guess is that, the age that we saw from here, so this is going back to the earliest tree we found is from 2006, and we were in here at the end of 2010. If I had to guess, the damage in Delaval, which was a stand that was directly across from the more industrial area, I would say probably the type of damage and the age of the damage looked very similar. So it's probably right around the same time. But I don't know about Vivendi. You would assume Vivendi was probably colonized around the same time. So we were thinking, 5+ years in these stands.
But that suggests then that they were concurrent attacks rather than sequential attacks.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could have had. I mean, you would think though here. I mean, well, yeah. It's looking back at where insects may have moved to, and that's a difficult scenario. But like this site, which is Boylston, is well outside of the area where Vivendi and Delaval were, but the damage was similar, is what I'm basing on, and I would think based on proximity, Vivendi and Delaval would have been attacked at a similar time, but that's a guess.
Sure.
100% guess.
Sure. Okay. Well, it looks like a lot of the questions have slowed down. Can you take just a minute to go back to those two pictures that I posted of the sugar maple larvae and exit hole? I don't know if Jesse's still on there. Do you want to just kind of reiterate some of your comments to the group, because some people may be seeing some of these bugs showing up, and just take us through your logic so that we can.
Yeah. And anybody can chime in as well, typing if you think I'm going down the wrong direction with this. But
so these were two pictures that were sent to me by Jesse Lyons with Cornell Cooperative Extension in Syracuse, and was I thought it was timely because Kevin was here, and the question was like, what is it? And then the real underlying question is, this is an ALB, is it? So we'll launch with that and for Kevin's response.
Right. So there's these two pictures. You know, right away when I saw them, I was pretty comfortable that it wasn't ALB, and this is more of an oval exit hole. That would be more indicative of a buprestid or a metallic wood boring beetle, and that's like what emerald ash borer is. You also, well, let's see. I'll try to get fancy here and switch between. If you think about this is kind of the common cerambycid or longhorn beetle exit hole with that ALB would make. And we've got, you can see it's a much more oval exit hole. We'd probably also see some fibrous frass, and although the bark hasn't been removed, if it had been, that's what you would look for. And then also around this general area, so they can actually be quite far on the tree, but you would look for that oviposition pit. So you can't have an ALB exit hole without an oviposition site somewhere. Then the next thing you would want to do is pop this bark off and look to see if you can see any type of gallery going in the phloem sapwood. So they score the sapwood and then turn into the gallery, then turns into the sapwood. So you'd see an oval sapwood entrance hole, and it's oval for longhorn beetles at that time, but they exit as round exit holes. So I'm pretty comfortable with that. Then looking here, it does look a lot like a cerambycid larva, but it's often difficult to tell, especially with some of the larger buprestids. If you don't have them laid out the right way, it's often difficult to tell a buprestid from a cerambycid. Sometimes it's very easy and obvious, and you get like kind of a more oval head, but we could also have a situation that these larvae, or this larva, is not the same species that made that exit hole as well. These have come in later and are now feeding in that phloem, and whatever came out was a buprestid that came out and left, and now these are longhorn beetles. So there's a lot that goes on to kind of piece through, but I see some other pieces of frass, but nothing is fibrous like you would see for ALB.
Okay. Great. Well, Kevin, I want to thank you very much. This was a fabulous webinar. We had great attendance. Well over 100 people joined in from all across the eastern U.S. And
awesome.
You've done a lot of work, and it's impressive to look at, to think about the efforts, the tree climbers, and the interagency coordination and cooperation that went into this was just a feat of amazing accomplishment. So it's very neat to see, and nice to very nice that you had a chance to get to do some research and keep track of this new development in the U.S. of a urban pest gone rural. So
yeah. Great. Well, thank you, Pete, for setting it up, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in as well. It's good, a lot of good questions.
Yes, indeed. All right, so we'll officially shut this down. I'm going to turn off the recording, and thank you all